Look, I've been around long enough to know that most people think they understand what impossible means. But let me tell you something that'll change that real quick. Picture this. It's 1881, and some French bureaucrat in Paris thinks it's a brilliant idea to build a railroad straight through the Sahara Desert. Not around it, not near it, but right through the heart of 9 million square kilometers of pure hell on Earth. That's bigger than the entire United States, by the way. Now, if that sounds insane to you, you're absolutely right. But what happened to the men who tried to make this fever dream a reality? That's where this story gets really dark, really fast. You gotta understand, back in those days, Europe was carving up Africa like it was some kind of birthday cake. They called it the Scramble for Africa. Real charming name, right? France wanted their peace, and they wanted it bad. Their grand plan was to connect Algeria to French Sudan, that's Mali today, with a railway that would run straight through Tuareg territory. The Tuareg, if you don't know, aren't exactly the welcoming committee type. They're fierce desert nomads who've been protecting their land for centuries, and they don't take kindly to uninvited guests. Enter Paul Flatters, a 40-something French military administrator with graying hair, chronic back pain, and a serious morphine habit. This guy was obsessed with the Sahara, and I mean obsessed. He'd spent years in North Africa, learned the local dialects, studied trade routes, and somehow convinced himself he understood the desert better than anyone back in Paris. When the French government started looking for someone crazy enough to scout this railway route, Paul practically begged for the job. Now here's where it gets interesting. Paul originally wanted to bring over 200 armed soldiers for protection. Makes sense, right? But some romantic explorer named Henry Duvier talked them out of it. This guy painted the Tuareg as honorable, peace-loving desert people. Yeah, about as peace-loving as a cornered rattlesnake. They compromised on less than half that number, which, spoiler alert, was their first fatal mistake. On January 25, 1880, Paul's first expedition set out from Constantine with 12 Europeans and a bunch of local guides. Picture this scene: endless sand dunes stretching to every horizon, temperatures hitting 105 degrees Fahrenheit on a good day, and these guys trudging through it with Victorian-era equipment. I've been to some tough places in my time, but this was something else entirely. They made it about 1,600 kilometers south to a place that was basically nowhere, realized they were completely outmatched, and wisely decided to turn back. But Paul wasn't done. Oh no, this morphine-addled dreamer was just getting started. Before they retreated, he sent a message to the local Tuareg chief, promising to return the following winter. Talk about signing your own death warrant. But that wasn't even the strangest part of this whole mess. You see, while Paul thought he was being diplomatic, the Tuareg were already 3 steps ahead of him. Word travels fast in the desert, faster than you'd think, and by the time Paul started planning his second expedition, every Tuareg fighter from Libya to Mali knew the French were coming back. November 1880 rolls around, and Paul sets out again, this time with over 90 men. Engineers, officers, soldiers, guides. A whole parade of Europeans and North Africans marching straight into what they didn't know was a carefully prepared trap. They even joined up with a Sufi religious leader's caravan, thinking it would signal peaceful intentions. The locals kept warning them, turn back, don't go into Tuareg territory, you're walking into trouble. But did Paul listen? Of course not. By February 16, 1881, they traveled almost 1,500 kilometers through pure desert and stopped at a watering hole called el-Garama. Now, if you're thinking this sounds like a perfect place for an ambush, you're getting the picture. What they didn't know was that 600 Tuareg fighters had been tracking them for weeks, studying their movements, waiting for the perfect moment. Here's where Paul made his final, fatal mistake. Despite everything, the warnings, the hostile territory, the growing tension, He left the main camp with just a small group of officers and scientists. A guide literally warned him something felt wrong, that it wasn't safe. Paul waved him off like he was swatting a fly. 30 minutes later, they were completely surrounded. What happened next was swift and absolutely brutal. Lances, old muskets, fighters coming from every direction. Paul and every single member of the expedition's leadership were killed on the spot, along with about 30 camel drivers. The camels, all 250 of them, were taken. No dramatic last stands, no heroic speeches. Just a group of men who'd walked straight into a perfectly executed ambush. Only 10 men managed to escape that initial slaughter, and they brought news back to the main camp that would haunt the survivors forever. Lieutenant Joseph de Dianas took command of the remaining 56 men, 4 French officers and a bunch of terrified locals. They burned most of their remaining supplies to keep them from falling into enemy hands, divided up what little food and water they had, and started the longest, most horrific walk of their lives. 1,500 kilometers back to safety, on foot, through the Sahara, while being hunted. If you think that's where the horror story ends, you're dead wrong. The Tuareg weren't finished with them, not by a long shot. They followed the survivors from a distance, picking them off like wolves stalking wounded prey. By February 22nd, less than a week after the massacre, the men were already running out of food. A few days later, they were eating anything they could find just to stay upright. Then the Tuareg pulled their cruelest trick yet. A group approached the desperate survivors, offering milk, meat, and fruit at extortionist prices. The men were so desperate they didn't question it. They just paid whatever was asked and devoured everything offered. The dates, it turned out, had been laced with a toxic plant that causes hallucinations, panic, and death. What followed was like something out of a nightmare. Men screaming and staggering around, others running wildly into the desert, gasping for air as the poison burned their lungs from the inside. Some were saved by vomiting up the poisoned food, but most weren't so lucky. While this chaos was unfolding, the Tuaregs struck again, capturing and beheading 3 guides who'd been smart enough not to eat the poisoned dates. The survivors scattered in all directions, breaking into smaller groups. But the nightmare wasn't over, not even close. As starvation set in and exhaustion took hold, these groups became increasingly paranoid, accusing each other of hoarding food and water. What little discipline remained evaporated completely. And then came the part that nobody talks about, the part that haunts me even now. As the men began dying one by one, and the survivors were too weak to bury them, they faced a choice no human being should ever have to make. The last surviving Frenchman, Sergeant Joseph Pobbergen, tried to resist as long as he could. When other soldiers gave mercy to one of the dying Algerians and offered him some of the meat for sustenance, he refused. But hunger, real hunger, the kind that drives you past the point of being human, that hunger won in the end. He joined them, and before long, he too was dead and consumed by the others. On April 2nd, 4 Algerian soldiers stumbled into Wargla, walking skeletons who could barely stand. Over the next few days, a few more were found crawling along the route or collapsed in the sand. By the end of the month, maybe a dozen survivors total had somehow made that impossible 1,500-kilometer journey through hell. When news of this disaster finally reached France, the reaction was immediate and explosive. The press went absolutely nuts, demanding revenge. Politicians called for swift military retaliation against the Tuareg. But here's the thing. Once the initial shock wore off, reality set in. The loss of Paul and his men had exposed just how little France actually knew about the Sahara and how completely unprepared they were to control it. The Trans-Saharan Railway plans were quietly shelved. Military expeditions into the desert were delayed for nearly 20 years. The French public needed someone to blame, and they found their scapegoat in Henry Duvivier, that romantic explorer who painted the Tuareg as peaceful. The press tore him apart. The guilt ate him alive. In 1892, 11 years later, he took his own life. What remained of the Flatters expedition were just letters written before the first attack and the scattered accounts of the few who'd survived long enough to tell the tale. Ironically, those became some of the only detailed information about the Central Sahara that the French had for decades. But here's what really gets me about this whole story, and if you've made it this far, you need to hear this part. The expedition was supposed to be about progress, about connecting civilizations, about bringing the wonders of modern transportation to the desert. Instead, it became a lesson in arrogance, in what happens when you underestimate both the people and the environment you're trying to control. Those men didn't just die in the desert. They were systematically hunted, poisoned, and driven to acts that stripped away their humanity. The Sahara didn't just defeat the French. It revealed the brutal reality behind all their colonial dreams. For the French government, this was a defeat they couldn't spin into something glorious, a moment of reckoning they couldn't escape. The desert is still there, as vast and unforgiving as ever. The railway was never built. And somewhere out there in those endless dunes, the bones of Paul Flatters and his men serve as a permanent reminder that some dreams are too ambitious, some territories too hostile, and some prices too high to pay. If this story has stuck with you, and trust me, it should drop haunted in the comments below. And if you know of any other expeditions that went horribly wrong, I want to hear about them. Because sometimes, the most important stories are the ones nobody wants to remember.